Hello, and welcome to episode 10 of Thinking Deliberately. This one is called imposter syndrome, and its opposite, false authority, confidence. So, in the last episode, we looked at leadership styles and why I think they are often nonsense. Not because leadership doesn't exist, but because leadership is not a fixed style. Leadership is a construction. I suspect you figured that out. A person constructs self, context, and response under pressure, and then everyone else has to live in the environment that construction creates. Well, today I want to look at something closely related, imposter syndrome, and its much more dangerous opposite, false authority confidence. Now, imposter syndrome is everywhere. People talk about it in leadership programs, coaching sessions, universities even might teach it. Workplaces, social media, women's networks, professional development events, and probably every other conference breakout session where someone has put the word authenticity on a PowerPoint slide. The usual story goes something like this. Successful people often secretly feel like frauds. They doubt themselves. They fear being found out. They assume their success is just luck. They discount their achievements and they compare their internal uncertainty with the other people's external confidence. And yes, that happens. It's real. Many competent people do feel like imposters. But I think we have allowed the phrase to become too broad, too sentimental, and too flattering. Because not all self doubt is imposter syndrome. Sometimes self doubt is appropriate. Sometimes uncertainty is not pathology. And sometimes the little voice saying, I may not know enough here, is not a psychological problem. Sometimes it's just awareness. That is the first thing we need to say. Feeling uncertain does not necessarily mean you lack confidence. It might mean you are aware of complexity. And in many contexts, awareness of complexity should reduce certainty. If you are stepping into a difficult leadership situation, a complex coaching conversation, or maybe a political question, an ethical decision, a human relationship, teaching environment, or a system you don't fully understand yet, a degree of uncertainty is not weakness, it's accuracy. The problem is not that you feel uncertain, the problem is what you construct from the uncertainty. At lower awareness, uncertainty may be constructed as evidence of inadequacy. I feel unsure, therefore I am not good enough. I do not know everything, therefore I do not belong here. I am not completely confident, therefore I must be pretending. That is one construction. But uncertainty can also be constructed differently. I feel unsure because the situation is complex. I do not know everything, so I need to learn. I am aware of limits, which means I may be less dangerous than someone who has none. And that is a very different construction. Same feeling, different meaning, different self, and therefore a different response. And this is why CDT changes the conversation. Constructive development theory does not simply ask, do you feel like an imposter? It asks, what are you constructing from your uncertainty? What is your intention? What are you aware of? What choices become available? And what response are you producing? Because imposter syndrome is not just a feeling, it's a construction of self in relation to competence, authority, expectation, belonging, comparison, and risk. The person constructing themselves as not enough, not expert enough, not experienced enough, or legitimate enough, maybe not even worthy enough, not ready enough. And once that construction takes hold, it shapes everything. They might over prepare, they might avoid opportunities, or they might minimize achievements. They may even seek reassurance. They may refuse visibility. They may attribute success to luck. And they may wait for permission from people who are less capable than they are, but more confident. We've all had a manager like that. And that really matters because imposter syndrome is not only an internal problem, it has a social cost. When competent, reflective people stay quiet because they doubt themselves, they leave space for the loudly certain. And the loudly certain are not always the most developed. In fact, very often, they're the least developed. Which brings us to the opposite problem, false authority confidence. This is the person who does not feel like an imposter, but perhaps should. The person who is not troubled by uncertainty because they are not sufficiently aware of what they do not understand. The person who speaks first speaks loudly, speaks often, and mistakes fluency for insight. The person who has one model, one explanation, one ideology, one leadership mantra, or one favorite framework, one answer to everything, and terrifying confidence to apply it everywhere. You know the type. The person who has never met a complex issue they could not simplify in 12 seconds. The person who says, it's just common sense, usually before saying something that proves it's not. The person who says, let me be clear, when what they mean is, let me remove all the complexity so I can feel in control. The person who mistakes confidence for competence, or they mistake certainty for leadership. The person who mistakes having an opinion for having done the thinking. This is far more dangerous than imposter syndrome because imposter syndrome often harms the self first. False authority confidence harms the environment. It enters the room with certainty and reduces everyone else's thinking. It creates pressure to agree. And it rewards simplicity by punishing doubt. It frames complexity as weakness. It turns reflection into hesitation. It turns caution into lack of ambition. And it turns disagreement into resistance. It turns awareness into inconvenience. And organizations often reward it. And that's the scandal. Workplaces love confidence. Universities pretend to love critical thinking, but often reward performance. Politics love certainty. Media loves strong opinions. Leadership cultures love people who can own the room. Boards love decisiveness, and social media loves bold claims. And in all those spaces, false authority confidence can thrive because low awareness certainty is easier to package than developmental complexity. It looks decisive, it sounds strong, it feels reassuring, and it gives people the illusion that someone knows what is going on, and humans love that illusion, especially under pressure. When people are anxious, they often do not want the most aware person in the room. They want the person who makes anxiety stop. And certainty does that, only temporarily and quite badly, often dangerously. This is why false authority confidence is so seductive. It creates emotional relief by collapsing complexity. The confident person says, this is the problem. This is the solution. These are the people to blame. This is what we need to do. There's no ambiguity, no self-questioning, no developmental humility, and no awareness of construction. And then the people around them just relax, not because the answer is good, but because the uncertainty has been removed. That is not leadership. That is psychological sedation. And yet many people confuse it with authority. From a CDT perspective, false authority confidence often comes from low awareness, constructing itself as high competence. The person cannot see the limits of their construction. They cannot see the assumptions underneath or beneath their conclusion. They cannot see the context they are ignoring, and they can't see the perspectives they have excluded. They can't even see the self that needs to be right or the emotional payoff of certainty. Finally, they can't see that their confidence may be evidence, not of mastery, but of imitation. And that is the brutal part. Sometimes confidence is not a sign that someone knows more. Sometimes it's a sign that they can see less. This is the opposite of what many leadership cultures believe. We often assume confidence means capacity, but confidence only tells us how someone relates to their construction. It does not tell us whether the construction is any good. A person may feel confident because they have examined the terrain deeply, or they may feel confident because they have mistaken a puddle for the ocean. Both may sound certain. Only one is useful. And this is where imposter syndrome becomes more interesting. Because some people who feel like imposters may actually be experiencing the discomfort of developmental awareness. They can see complexity. They can see the limits. They can see multiple perspectives. They can see that their knowledge is partial and that consequences matter. They can see that authority should not be worn casually. They can see that the situation deserves more than performance. So they hesitate. And then because our culture worships confidence, they interpret that hesitation as evidence of deficiency. But perhaps it is not deficiency. Perhaps it is reverence for complexity. Perhaps it is a sign that the person can see more than the confident idiot next to them. This does not mean all imposter feelings are noble. They're not. Sometimes imposter syndrome is fear and it's perfectionism or internalized criticism. Maybe it's an attachment to external validation, which is what I think it is. It's an external, in Keegan's terms, it's a level 3 problem. It's not available at level 4. Sometimes it is the inability to integrate success into identity. Sometimes it is a construction of self as permanently unworthy, and that needs work. But we should be careful not to pathologize every form of self-questioning. A person who never doubts themselves is not necessarily healthy. They may simply be developmentally unavailable to doubt. And a person who doubts themselves is not necessarily weak. They may be standing at the edge of a more complex construction. This is why the real aim is not confidence. I know that sounds strange. The self-help world is obsessed with confidence. Be more confident, speak more confidently, lead with confidence, show up with confidence, believe in yourself, own your worth. Other such nonsense like step into your power. Fair enough. But confidence without awareness is dangerous. The aim is not confidence. The aim is calibrated authority. And that means your felt sense of competence is appropriately related to your actual awareness, skill, knowledge, context, and responsibility. Not too low, not too inflated. Calibrated. If you are competent, you should not shrink. If you are not competent, you should not perform certainty. If the situation is simple, you do not need to overcomplicate it. If the situation is complex, you should not pretend it is simple because you enjoy sounding decisive. Calibrated authority means knowing when to speak, when to ask, when to pause, when to decide, when to challenge, when to admit your limits, and when to take responsibility. And that all of that requires awareness, not just confidence. Because confidence asks, can I do this? Awareness asks, what is this? What am I constructing? What do I know? What do I not know? What am I assuming? How do I know what I know? What is the risk of my certainty? And maybe what is the risk of my silence? What response does this context actually require? And that is much more sophisticated and much less marketable. You cannot sell calibrated authority as easily as confidence. Confidence sells because it feels like a product. Awareness develops because it is a practice. And this brings us back to imposter syndrome. The question is not simply, how do I stop feeling like an imposter? The better question is, what is my imposter feeling telling me? And from what level of awareness am I constructing it? If the feeling is revealing a real competence gap, then learn. If it is revealing a lack of preparation, then prepare. And if it's revealing an inflated standard of perfection, then examine your standard. If it's revealing fear of visibility, then examine the self that feels unsafe being seen. If it is revealing that you are in a genuinely complex context, then do not shame yourself for uncertainty. Use it, because uncertainty can become intelligence if awareness is present. But uncertainty without awareness becomes paralysis. Certainty without awareness becomes arrogance. And authority without awareness becomes dangerous. That is the triangle. Imposter syndrome can shrink competent people. False authority confidence can inflate incompetent people. Dynamic intelligence helps us calibrate. It asks us to become aware of the construction of competence, confidence, doubt, identity, and response in the moment. This matters in leadership. A leader with imposter feelings may over-rely on approval, over-prepare, avoid hard calls, or defer to louder voices. A leader with false authority confidence may make premature decisions, silence dissent, punish complexity, and confuse obedience with alignment. Neither is ideal. The developmental leader does something different. They hold authority without needing to perform certainty. They can say, I don't know, without collapsing. They can say, I am responsible, without pretending omniscience. And they can say, look, this is complex, without using complexity as an excuse for inaction. They can make a decision while remaining aware that it is constructed from partial information. That is mature authority. not swagger, not self-doubt, not motivational confidence, calibrated, aware, responsible action. And this matters in education too. Students often feel like imposters because they think everyone else understands. They compare their internal confusion with other people's external performance. But learning should involve confusion. If you are never confused, you're probably not learning. You may just be repeating what already fits your current construction. And in organizations, imposter syndrome can be especially cruel because the most reflective people often hold themselves to a higher standard than the system requires, while the least reflective people move upward through confidence, politics, and performance. This is how environments become stupid, not because they lack intelligent people, but because intelligent people self-silence, while confident simplifiers take the room. That is a collective awareness problem. A low awareness culture rewards false authority confidence and then wonders why decision making deteriorates. It calls caution negativity. It calls reflection hesitation. It calls complexity overthinking. It calls confidence leadership. And then it acts surprised when the confident people break things. So we need a better distinction. Imposter syndrome says, I may not belong here. False authority confidence says, I obviously belong here and I'm probably above everyone else. Dynamic intelligence says, what is required here? What am I aware of? What are my limits? And what response can I construct responsibly? That is the move. Not from doubt to confidence, from unconscious construction to calibrated awareness. So here is the uncomfortable question for this episode. Where are you under authorizing yourself? And where are you over authorizing yourself? What are you shrinking from? Something that you are capable of because your awareness of complexity has been mislabeled as inadequacy. And where are you performing certainty because you cannot tolerate the humiliation of not knowing? Both matter because imposter syndrome can keep wisdom silent, false authority confidence can put stupidity in charge. And if we're honest, most of us have done both. We have all shrunk when we should have spoken, and we've all spoken when we should have listened. The developmental task is to notice the construction, to catch the self that is collapsing, to catch the self that is inflating, and to catch the moment where uncertainty could become either paralysis or inquiry. To catch the moment where confidence could become either responsibility or arrogance. That is awareness, and that is dynamic intelligence. That is thinking deliberately. And this is Thinking Deliberately, the podcast. And today's uncomfortable thought is this. Feeling like an imposter may not prove you are inadequate, and feeling certain may not prove you are competent. The real question is whether your authority is aware enough to be trusted. Thank you.